Much, Xander, and thanks so much for the opportunity to present here today. For those of you, it's great actually to see a lot of familiar faces or names, but for those of you that don't know me, I am physically based in Colorado, while other members of our organization, the Community Wildfire Planning Center, we have a staff member in California and another one in British Columbia. So we work with communities across the US providing technical assistance, and we do research, and we also make policy solutions or recommendations for policy solutions about wildfire risk related to the built environment. We also manage a few parcel level type programs for wildfire risk assessments. So next slide, Xander. So you can see where we generally fit in on the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network graphic related to plans, codes, and ordinances. However, on the next slide, when I really look at this graphic, I think about how all of our work touches on so many other aspects of fire adaptation. So you could probably make an argument for many of these circles, and I'm sure a lot of everyone's work on the phone here too has these, this interconnectivity and relationships. Next slide. So I think for our work, a lot of this interconnectivity is really due to the fact that the wildland-urban interface is so complex, and that the built and natural environments can't really be neatly separated into these predictable categories, but truly requires a multidisciplinary and collaborative approach. I've been working with WUI communities across the country for many years, and in some cases there are some similarities, but in so many other ways, so many of the communities we work with are very unique. So I'll try and speak to some of those unique aspects today. Next slide. It may come as somewhat of a surprise. A lot of my WUI research, I get interested in the history of the WUI and how we've come to look at what types of plans or regulatory guidance we have in place today. So I just wanted to frame this a little bit because I think it's helpful context is, a lot of the WUI planning discussions that I'll bring up aren't necessarily new. Back in, I don't know, 15 years ago, 10 or 15 years ago, when I was working at the NFPA, I remember a colleague, bringing out this copy of this fire protection and prevention for summer homes and forested areas from what was then called the Forest Committee. This was in the 1930s. It was a copy from this, and it was so eye-opening because it focused a lot on the interior and exterior of structures. In this case, it was more like summer cabins, and this was back when the concern was for fire in the upper Midwest, for example. But what was interesting is a lot of that material and the guidance was really not that different from what we talk about today for the structure itself. Next slide. And then fast forward a few decades, in the 1960s, you've probably heard of the Bel Air Brentwood fire in 1961 in California, Southern California. And this was really, I think, the first time that I can see in my research where this relationship between the location of development, topography, and wildfire behavior was starting to gain more traction and understanding. Next slide. So this was a very high profile fire. They called it a celebrity fire in LA because one of the more famous pictures was from President Nixon using his garden hose to wet the wood shingled roof off of his rental house. But there was also a lot of fascinating material that comes out of this. Next slide. So if you ever have 20 minutes, I really encourage you to Google a YouTube video called Design for Disaster. And again, this was back in the 60s where they talk about after this fire, some of the contributing factors related to why so many structures burned. And there's a few things that are outdated, but generally speaking, they talked about firebrands and how the influence of topography and wind played a role in where the structures were located on the top of a ridgeline or a hill. And they also said at the end that a group from NFPA had come out to the area in the 1950s and assessed the community design and called it a design for disaster. So of course, when I saw this video, I was thinking, this is, you know, here we are 50 plus years, 60 plus years later now, still talking about similar issues. Next slide. And then in the 1970s, I've done some interviews and research based on Jack Cohen and Steve Pine's work. And from their research, the earliest terms that I could find of the WUI was in the 1970s, when a researcher from Stanford talked about the WUI, and he said in its simplest terms, the fire interface is any point where the fuel feeding a wildfire changes from natural wildland fuel to man-made urban fuel. And for this to happen, wildland fire must be close enough for its flying brands or flames to contact the flammable parts of the structure. So this is where we really started to see that emergence of these concepts. And again, today, I think there's really a strong connection to how I still think about the WUI in my practice. Next slide. And then now into the decade of the 80s, again, really interesting research. The U.S. Forest Service Pacific Southwest Forest and Range Experiment Station issued some guidance on protecting residences from wildfires. You know, they talked about land use planning and zoning specifically, and property development and structural design. Next slide. And then, of course, in the 90s and early 2000s, when we started to see more emergence of, you know, model codes and standards for implementation. This is also when the state of California first started to adopt statewide land use planning requirements. Next slide. So we've known about the WUI for decades. We've had guidance on the WUI for decades, but we also continue to see growth in the WUI. I'm sure many of you have seen these data sets. These next 3 slides, you can just go forward, Xander, to see, to some extent, you can see the progression of the WUI over a several decade period. This is based on the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Silvas Lab and the U.S. Forest Service research and data. And so perhaps though in this next slide, what's most telling is their analysis on the rapid growth in the WUI during this time period. And the darkest shades is where was more than a 75% increase in the WUI. Next slide. And this growth is starting to show more significant consequences than I think we could see in the past. Between 2005 and 2020, we lost more than 89,000 structures to wildfire. I was thinking as I was reviewing the slide that already that feels so outdated with this recent wildfire season that's still in progress. Next slide. And an analysis from the Silvas Lab research also showed that their research in 2018 showed that, you know, between 1990 and 2010, there were 100,000 houses that were added to areas that had previously burned. One of this in the slide shows the Tubbs fire from California. And so we're not only increasing where homes are being built in the WUI, but we're also adding them back to places where we know there's a fire history. Next slide. So the questions today are really, you know, we talk about land use planning more. I think it's gotten more attention, which is very exciting for me as a planner who has focused on wildfire. But, you know, it's like, well, we've known about this for a while. What will it really take to get us there? I'm not going to suggest that land use planning alone can solve all of the complexities of wildfire. But I do want to highlight several ways that I approach wildfire risk reduction through land use planning concepts in my work, and how much of what I've learned is from communities. I'm sure many of you on the phone doing good work as well. So I want to convey some of those concepts and then talk about tools and a bit more of the research we've been doing related to this. Next slide. So one way we address the WUI is through the site design and layout process. And so, for example, when new subdivisions are being proposed, the communities can determine where it's appropriate to place the subdivision. This is typically tied to a hazard map that identifies where the highest wildfire hazard areas are. Some states are also creating WUI maps. So there's an alternative. It's not always only a hazard assessment, although I'm a big advocate of where we have hazard assessments, there's also the option for a site level or a site specific property assessment too, to really look at some of the more detailed aspects of the parcel. These planning requirements can sometimes direct development away from high hazard areas. That is more rare that I see. It's certainly not a bad option, but typically we see more focus on, okay, we know there's the hazard, how are we going to mitigate it to the degree that's acceptable to reduce the hazard? Next slide. So primary way is through adequate access and water supply. That's, you know, to me, this is one of the most critical things that first responders need, is the ability to safely respond to an area, and also for the public and residents to safely evacuate from the area. It's surprising to me how often I see that communities don't have these basics in place, that we are unfortunately approving subdivisions in areas that, you know, may require water to be trucked in during a wildfire event that could take up to an hour in some cases, so or more. Similarly, on this next slide, a few years ago, I was touring a community. I won't name the community, but it is somewhat close to my home in the state. I was touring this community with some planners, and they had just pointed out that they had approved a several hundred unit subdivision back where you can sort of see where this road goes. This was the only way in and out, but they said, well, we'll be asking, or we'll be requiring the homes to be mitigated, which is great. Homes, you know, having defensible space and proper building materials. But at the end of the day, that, you know, looking at construction materials is not a surrogate for evacuation planning. So you still only have one access. So I just, you know, I don't see those two as either or. I see them as both, and for different reasons. Next slide. I don't know if Chief Novak is still on the webinar, but I saw that he joined, and I'll just invite him to add anything in the chat here. But a few years ago, I had the opportunity to interview him after another fire here in Colorado. And this was really eye-opening for me to listen to his description of this area at night. And so what, you know, looks fairly benign during the day, it's not steeply graded. There's not really a lot of vegetation in terms of, you know, difficult clearance. But the way he described it at night was, you know, not really having any understanding. There was no reflective signage, there were no lights, and, you know, directing his crew to an area to protect homes was, you know, a very challenging process, because they didn't have familiarity with this area and didn't really know what kind of situation they were getting themselves into. So I always encourage planners to think about these different conditions, you know, thinking about it, this is not in the daylight, like what are these conditions when it's a wildfire scenario. Next slide. So planners can also consider adjacent land uses like open space as part of community design to ideally reduce wildfire risk. I think it's important for us to be aware that this requires a very intentional approach and working with other land managers, so it doesn't just happen by default. In other words, you know, there's been a lot of buzz, at least in some of my professional discussions, about, you know, how open space can act as a natural fuel break, which is great. But I think that it's important to keep in mind that this isn't automatic. It's not a fuel break by default. It's a fuel break because it gets managed as a fuel break. So this really takes a lot of collaboration between planners and other partners like open space management, recreational districts, etc. And of course, professional foresters or fire behavior folks. Next slide. So these wildland areas and trail systems and open space also become really important inside a community. This is an example from the Waldo Canyon fire, when, as if some of you might be familiar with this from Colorado, where the fire came down and carried through the neighborhood where vegetation had not been managed in these ravines, and the wind pushed it through. Some of these homes that were close to the edge that did not have a setback were susceptible to the direct flame contact, as opposed to some of the homes that were set back from the slope and had more defensible space and clearance. So there were, I know, some other factors involved, as there always are, in terms of response or irrigation. But we see this in many cases, that increased setbacks from a slope do make a difference for home survival during a wildfire event. Sometimes there's other reasons why setbacks are critical, for geological reasons. But in any case, the setbacks become important during the development process. And then the maintenance of the fuels is critical, after the development, well, before and after. Next slide. So moving down to a smaller scale, you may have heard the term structure ignition zone, which refers to the structure and surrounding area. And from a planning standpoint, there is a lot we can do for having defensible space requirements. Some communities have plant species lists of what you can and can't plant within a certain distance of the home. California recently passed legislation that will be mandating homeowners in certain areas across the state to have the first 5 feet of the structure managed as a non-combustible or ember-resistant zone. So this is, we also know many other communities may do this more at the local level, as opposed to, it's not statewide yet. But I think it's really exciting, because we know this is really an area where embers collect and becomes very important to manage. Next slide. So not directly related to land use, but I should say it's related to land use, but it's not sometimes under the bailiwick of planners, is what building materials and construction materials are required. Of course, this is a very critical topic for the WUI. I just wanted to acknowledge that it's an area that is closely linked, but not always underneath the purview of land use. But it goes without saying that, for me, ignition resistant building materials and construction methods for homes and attachments are critically important as well. Next slide. So we also think about land uses, not just residential areas, but other land uses, and whether or not certain conditions might need to be placed on them if they are in areas that are susceptible to wildfire, or if they could be a threat to neighbors. So, for example, sawmills or gasoline, other places that store petrochemicals, other areas that may store just combustible materials. As well as vulnerable uses like hospitals, care facilities, et cetera. All of these carry additional considerations. They may be, should you have additional setbacks from any nearby vegetation? Should you have more of an evacuation plan for these vulnerable uses? So these are additional considerations within the land use framework that aren't specific just to residential areas. Next slide. And then I wanted to say a final note about density and the concepts around density and development planning, development patterns. There's different data coming from California now that the data sets are large enough to look at, where homes are getting lost during wildfire events. Some of it is pointing to that there are more home losses in high density areas. And then next slide. And then some losses are more focused on, well, there's this broad intermix that's low density and there's more losses happening there. So which one should we pick? And I don't think of it as an either or. I think of it more that depending on what the density is, there are different mitigations for each one. And then stepping back a little bit further, not just as a wildfire planner, but looking more broadly at planning in general, I think it's really critical that we look at how else we need to be planning communities, not just for wildfire, but for lowering carbon emissions, creating less car-dependent communities, all of these other activities for planning that really will move us towards a future that is not contributing to climate change. So I just wanted to add that note as well about this is planning for wildfire also has to be nested ultimately within, planning for communities for the future. Next slide. So I wanted to run through a few planning tools. I think many of them you'll be familiar with, but just wanted to highlight a couple points about them. Next slide. The first is the set of plans that I most commonly work with in our practice. So it would be the comprehensive plan, which is sometimes in other states called the general plan or master plan or growth policy if you're in Montana. And then the community wildfire protection plan and hazard mitigation plan. Next slide. So typically planners, we use the comprehensive plan as something that can guide very long-term planning frameworks for this 20 to 30 year horizon. More and more as a best practice, and in some cases required, as in California, you have to, in some cases, address natural hazards, or as a minimum, or excuse me, as a best practice, some communities are doing this already. So states can specify the type of policies that may be required to address wildfire. In the case of California, they have a very robust approach to hazard planning. Their state law says basically that you're required to address hazards in your general plan. Included in that is wildfire, and they have a very specific set of requirements. Next slide. It's generally tied to their statewide map for fire hazard severity zones, but it's much broader than just looking at the map. There's a lot of guidance. They also have a dedicated land use planning program within CAL FIRE that supports communities in the update of their general plan safety elements. Next slide. So California is definitely a best practice in this realm. I was really surprised. So our nonprofit took on some research last year that was funded by the Hewlett Foundation to look at 4 different states, Colorado, California, Montana, and Washington, in terms of how each state generally had their planning framework set up for how they are, or in some cases are not, really addressing the WUI through planning and legislation and regulation. And I was surprised to see in 2 different examples, Colorado, in their state statutes here, counties and municipalities both are required to adopt a master plan, but only municipality master plans must address hazards and the locations of hazards and land use topics related to that. Counties in Colorado are not required to address hazards. So we took on an analysis to see, well, does it hold true? My hypothesis was, I don't think then if you're not required to, I think there's going to be some gaps in where communities have a WUI risk, counties have a WUI risk, but aren't adding it into their master plan. And we did recently confirm that with some additional research. So that is on our website, and I'm happy to share a link after this too for the report. Similarly, in Washington state, many jurisdictions are required to adopt a comprehensive plan based on the state's Growth Management Act, but also hazard elements are optional. Next slide. So 2 other plans that this audience is likely more familiar with are hazard mitigation plans and community wildfire protection plans. And really with this point, I just want to make the point that these tools provide an opportunity for planners to be aware of those plans. And again, in some cases, in some states, there has to be a connection between hazard mitigation plan and the comprehensive plan. But as a best practice, we recommend to planners that they're really focused on what to be aware of from those plans, what content is in there that could help inform long-term, long-range land use planning decisions. So for example, the Community Wildfire Protection Plan, if it's current and it has a wildfire hazard map, that is really a good location to point land use decisions to. Do we want to build in areas that are high hazard, and what does that look like? Similarly, next slide. We want to encourage how these 3 plans can really integrate policies and actions and strategies. So this is also to say we also don't want to see duplication sometimes in our work when we're looking at these 3 plans. You may see two different hazard maps being referred to. One's outdated, one's current. Some policies point in one direction, the others point in another. So I think this is really, it's an easy opportunity to manage plans and really align policies together. However, I always hear this criticism. I shouldn't say always, but many times I hear this criticism, and people say, "Well, Molly, this is great. Plans are helpful, but they're only as helpful as the extent to which they get implemented, and most of the time they just sit on a shelf." So, next slide. I think that's a fair criticism, but it's why I'm also a proponent of regulations. I think in the world of WUI planning, we see many effective regulations. I know there's always a point of tension for some communities in terms of whether they or not they want to regulate themselves, but truly I see in my practice, those communities that I would consider more fire adapted are those communities that also include regulations as part of their approach to the WUI. So the main regulations that I live in when I'm looking and thinking about this is the building code, the fire code, subdivision regulations, the zoning, or sometimes it's called the land development code. And then there's the WUI code, which is sometimes a hybrid that combines many elements from these different regulatory options. Next slide. So building codes and fire codes and WUI codes, they're often based on model codes or standards, and they're amended appropriately. For example, if any of you are from the state of Washington, you'll probably be more familiar with, in 2018, the state adopted portions of the ICC WUI code, which became part of the state building code and took effect earlier this year. Their new statewide code includes requirements for ignition-resistant construction. The state also has adopted the International Fire Code, which is effective in all counties and cities in the state, and that code contains also a chapter on the WUI. Now, I know I said earlier that planners may not live in the world of building and fire codes, but I think it's really important for us to be aware of what's in those codes and how they may conflict or supplement or overlap what our broader objectives are for the WUI. For example, next slide, sometimes you'll find subdivision regulations can be very similar to a fire code, but sometimes they're in a county or municipal code. And so we have to know where to navigate to if we're looking at both the fire code and subdivision regulations to see, for example, how access is regulated or grades, water supply, etc. So it's important, even if I'm not personally, looking at, I should say I always am looking at what's in a fire code, but I, as a planner, would be more familiar with how to navigate through the subdivision regulations and then the zoning and land development code. And this is a good plug for something we always talk about, which is collaboration between planning and fire departments. Next slide. So what I see most often is communities really using some combination of several of these regulatory approaches and plans. I think LA County is a good example. It is complex, but they have a building code, a fire code, a subdivision code, a zoning code, which is only for the wildfire portion, is only for a portion of their county. And then they have a general plan and a hazard mitigation plan, and they're working on a countywide community wildfire protection plan, all related to the WUI. So it really is a constellation sometimes of plans and regulations that fit together. And some of the challenge, at least in our work and how we work with communities, is really helping them understand what they have and how it fits together and who does what and how it gets administered. Next slide. So just some of the challenges through our recent research and just years of planning experience is that, especially when we tie back to this question of can land use really help the situation of the WUI? One of the challenges that I see is this continued demand for housing, and there are a lot of areas that will continue to experience pressures. So, for example, in Colorado, and this is representative of many other states in the Rocky Mountains. Colorado's projected to see a 40% increase in population by 2050. And so I often hear people say, well, you know, existing development is our biggest challenge. I don't think there's a biggest challenge. I think there are many challenges, and I don't want to ignore what's coming or what kind of impact we could make for the future. So to me, it's like, well, at least we have a shot of getting some future growth right or better. So I think that's just something that we can't, it's not an either or. Either we address existing or we address the new. Another thing we see, I mentioned Colorado and Washington have some barriers. You know, Montana was another one that came out through our research that has some legislative barriers. I'm sure there's other states, but we're only looking at 4 for our research. That, for example, Montana's legislation prohibits local governments from denying the approval of a proposed subdivision based solely on the parcels within the subdivision being designated as WUI parcels. So often we see, you know, you must do this. It was ironic when we, you know, looked at Montana state statutes and said, wow, they're saying you can't do this just because something's in the WUI. You can't deny the subdivision. So they also have some other restrictions on what type of mitigation can or can't be required by a local authority. So that was kind of an interesting approach, or I shouldn't say approach, but some of the interesting legislative barriers that they have created for some of the local jurisdictions. Couple other just quick things for challenges that we see is that too often, I think this is a very reactionary approach to legislation and planning. In other words, so many times we see communities or states having a bad fire year and then they do something about it with bills, which is better than nothing, definitely, but it's hard. You know, it's hard to see where we have this opportunity to be proactive rather than waiting for, waiting for the big disasters to occur and then figuring out what would be helpful for communities. So I know it's sometimes wishful thinking. It's understandable why we are sometimes reactionary, but in my ideal world, we'd be much more proactive. And then the other challenge that we encountered very clearly in our recent research is that there's just a lack of technical resources for planners when it's either hard for them to engage because they're often not brought to the table, or they don't always have at the local level the type of resources that would be helpful for them. So next slide. So I know there's some questions in the chat, which we'll get to here in a moment, but just to kind of wrap up this and our research on this discussion, we did suggest some recommended solutions that might help move things forward from a WUI planning perspective. Again, many of the states we analyzed in the report would really benefit from an increased statewide influence on WUI planning, whether that's legislation or additional types of resources and tools that they could provide. So we talked about Colorado and Montana and Washington. But you know, what's another interesting thing that we found is Montana, for example, could expand current requirements that they have now so that all counties must adopt a growth policy for their entire jurisdictional area instead of giving them these options. So, you know, to me, starting at some of the basics and just requiring that counties across the West have a master plan and or comprehensive plan with looking at wildfire hazard would be a pretty significant win. Also just speaking to, you know, when initiatives are set up at a state level, oftentimes they're housed within a natural resource department, which is fantastic that, you know, natural resource departments are taking the lead. However, it really ideally should include land use planners in this discussion if we're talking about the WUI. Often I just see that disconnect between, you know, what's happening with WUI discussions, but what doesn't necessarily include people that are making decisions about where development is going. And then another opportunity would be to, you know, engage planners on WUI topics and promote learning opportunities around that. So there are many states moving this forward. It's exciting to see more trainings. In fact, we're working with CAL FIRE right now to develop a land use planner training in California. I know there's some others moving forward in other states, and it's just exciting to see that there is some more momentum around this, and I hope it continues. And then, of course, dedicating resources and funding. I don't probably need to go into this too much, but it's definitely something that we would recommend. And then an area that I think is a little bit underserved but has potential is looking at identifying and potentially transferring some other best practices for other hazards to wildfire. Some certainly may not be appropriate, but others, there's, for example, some gaining interest in or growing interest in managed retreat. Whether or not that's the solution for wildfire, I think we don't know yet, but I think exploring it, if we're exploring it for sea level rise, it's at least interesting to contemplate for wildfire and see, is there an opportunity? And if so, what does that look like for wildfire? So next slide. So just key takeaways. Again, we focus on one area. We focused on one area today, but I know from my practice and all of the practices that I see everyone engaged in, that holistic approach really is necessary. So we try to do work we try to focus our work on supporting where we fit into the fire adapted communities approach, but where we also know these linkages exist and how we can promote collaboration. Next slide. So just a couple resources to highlight. We also have these on our website, communitywildfire.org. I tend to think of this as a little bit of a curated list. So there's a lot of resources out there, but we don't, we try to recommend those that we find most useful. Next slide. So thank you so much for the opportunity to share my perspectives on WUI planning. I know there have been some questions in the chat, and if we, for some reason don't get to your questions today, happy to have you reach out to me. My email is here, molly@communitywildfire.org.
Thank you so much, Molly. That was great. It really, the history piece really got my mind thinking, and I appreciate the way you kind of step through different scales and link them all together. So thank you. Let's start. Becca Samolsky from Fire Adapted Colorado had a question. Molly, can you please speak a little to plans and codes that address future development and the opportunities to improve existing developed areas? So that kind of, okay, we can change codes for the future, but what about what we've already got?
Yeah, and I don't know if you're able to, Xander, if people can do this, but can people take themselves off mute to ask the question in a little more detail? I think that might be
sure
for me.
Yeah, participants should be able to unmute, and we've got a fairly large group, but Becca, if you're still on here and can unmute, if you're in a place you can, great.
Hey, Molly. I was just really wanting to know more about specific strategies for the existing homes, because you went into a fair amount of detail on the future homes. So what are some of those things we can really do to change existing?
Well, this is not so much from a regulatory standpoint, but I think this is where we see a lot of gains with some of the voluntary programs like Firewise, there's a lot more growing interest in home ignition zone / parcel level assessment programs. I know, Becca, you're familiar with it, but Real Fire is the one that we've been working with Eagle County on, and there's many other similar ones across the state. But I think that tackling at the neighborhood scale, the Firewise is very helpful, and also at the parcel scale. And then those parcel level assessments, providing some type of incentives. For some people, it's insurance premium reductions. For others, it's just knowing that they're reducing their risk and working with their neighbors. From a regulatory standpoint, it's very difficult to I don't think I know of any code that actually implements a retroactive approach. If you do know of one, anyone, let me know. I'd be curious to hear. Most of the time, what triggers some type of not so much for land use, but what would be triggered for at least the structure would be in the regulatory framework, whether it's a development code or something else, the building code, would be a requirement for retrofit. So essentially, whenever a building permit would be required, that's when communities, even if it's for an upgrade of some sort, that's when communities can go in and say, okay, well, now that you're doing this, we're going to require that. I think, and if someone is from Ashland here, they can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that Ashland has done something similar. So even if you're going in for a building permit, but then, and Boulder County does this too, then you have to look at, well, what's the vegetation? What is your risk to wildfire? Now that we, there has to be some nexus. You can't just suddenly have to spend thousands and thousands of dollars for something that you might be putting in a fence for, $500. So has to be some relationship. Otherwise, it's politically extremely difficult to pass. I will add really quickly that we're working with the State Board of Forestry and Fire Protection on their fire safe regulations update. And when I say we, this is actually wearing my consulting hat, but we are supporting that effort. And right now the state is, as they're looking to update those fire safe regulations, they are looking at ways that they could possibly look at how to get at some of the existing conditions. It's, it's still in draft form, so I can't comment on any more specifics than that, but I do see this as a question coming up more and more is, can we regulate this to the degree where we just aren't continuing to put communities in this position?
I think there's also an interesting aspect around equity when we think about existing communities, existing issues, and how, even the point you made about, okay, someone goes in for a building permit and suddenly there's a nexus around maybe vegetation. Well, those can have differing impacts depending on the sort of socioeconomic position of a homeowner. And so I think that will be, because I think that's where we have to go in the long run. So how we implement those and how we think about, well, can we address some of the potential equity issues? And we even see that homes are lost during a wildfire and rebuilding, and then suddenly you're maybe rebuilding to new codes, and that can have equity issues as well as improvements. Yeah. But the question here from Brendan, Molly, is it common for communities to exempt existing structures from new regulations that go into effect? And so this is sort of building on the same topic. How do you see communities handling this challenge? Maybe we've sort of addressed Brendan's issue already, but maybe it's a chance to add more.
Yeah, no, typically, again, it's if a community puts regulations in today, it won't apply to everything that's out there. I mean, there may be some exceptions, but generally speaking, unless there's some reason to pull a permit, communities can't go back and say, okay, now everything that's out there suddenly has to be upgraded to this new standard, regardless of whether or not you're doing anything. So we don't see that. And that's, again, where we need to kind of plug the holes with other ways of reaching the people that are already, there's kind of two situations here. One is if you're already built, but in some cases, if you were, as of whatever date is August 21st, 2021, some communities said, okay, today we've adopted new regulations. In many cases, it still doesn't even apply to whether a permit was perhaps pulled 6 months ago and approved, or if you had a subdivision that had been approved, but you haven't built it yet. Oftentimes the new regulations that went in effect today don't go back in time to what was approved. And, someone said, yes, you don't, this is what you are required to do. So it really is like today and moving forward for whatever requires that permit.
Elliot asks a question about, are there contractors who could be hired to do a comprehensive review of state or county integration of WUI fire plans into existing general plans, laws, etc., especially regarding building new developments? That could be used as a basis for advocating future changes to codes, laws, plans, etc. So I don't know, Molly, if you want to comment on that. My guess is it's not the issue that contractors to do the work, but someone to pay for the study to be done.
Yes, that is a great question. It's something that we've been doing for years. And so there are contractors that also do and provide guidance. I'd say more so we see other contractors in California, less so in states where there's not necessarily a requirement to do this. And funding generally is the issue. You know, a lot of times we've been able to work with communities because there's been some grant or it's tied to some other project. Like if we're helping a community update their CWPP, then it's a good excuse to look at everything else. But it's driven more by, unfortunately, the lack of resources that communities often feel they have access to hire, you know, qualified professionals to help them. But if you can fit it in under some other platform, like you're updating your master plan, it's a good time to peel back the layers of some other codes, or not codes, excuse me, other plans. And similarly, if you're updating your land development code, that's another excuse where, you know, whoever the community is working with, if they have someone on their team who has expertise in the WUI and wildfire, that can be a really nice way to affordably fit it in for them.
Yeah, great. Kelly asks, is there a plan that you think is a best practice for people to look at when developing their own plans? And I guess maybe we've talked about a couple of different kinds of plans. So maybe Molly, if you have example plans from sort of CWPPs, all hazard, et cetera, that might fully answer that.
Sure. So I would say, and I know sometimes, this is a funny side note story. We were working with a community in a state I will not name, but it was a state a few years ago, and they said, we want to know the best practice, but don't tell us anything from California. So we sort of chuckled because we were like, well, the question you're asking really points to California. So I will say in this case that the best general plans that integrate wildfire I have seen are, I think, almost 100% from California. I think that's a function both of because they have to address wildfire hazard, but also because it's a very real concern, as obviously most of us know. So California is a great example for that type of plan. Also, stay tuned. We're working with the Office of Planning and Research in California on a WUI best practices planning inventory, which will be published in probably next spring on their adaptation clearinghouse. So again, I know it's state-based and everyone wants, you know, local examples, but I think there's a lot we can learn from other states that are figuring this out. So that'll be a really good resource for anyone to look at, a free resource to see what are these other communities doing.
And at the risk of self-promotion, I put a link to some work we did in New Mexico. So not a California example, looking at CWPPs and local mitigation efforts and how effective they were. So that provides some examples, some specific examples of CWPPs that were, you know, had good parts and bad parts and some of the challenges. So hopefully that's useful as well. Let's see, Ken asks, have you seen any jurisdictions require a WUI assessment on the purchase of a new home, as is done for things like radon or floodplain or asbestos disclosures?
Yeah, again, I'm going to sound probably like a California promotional materials here, but they did just pass some recent legislation on tied more to real estate hazard disclosures, but there's an assessment component to it. Again, just for the site, not for like a WUI community-wide assessment, but I think actually on our, on the communitywildfire.org on our website, we had a little news blurb about it. So you can actually look at the legislation that would be coming out, which I think is interesting. And then for some, we've also worked more locally with realtors here in like the Vail Valley, and they have an interest in at least, maybe it's not a required assessment, but how they could provide some materials and information into the process if people are interested about wildfire.
And does that feed at all into insurance? Because that's obviously a potential driver sort of outside what's you know, in the market world, right? Like, can you get insurance as you're buying a new home? Maybe as much of a alert as something that was on the deed.
Mhm. Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a very hot topic in many places. From our experience right now, it varies so much from even jurisdiction, state to state, company to company. I think it's difficult, at least from my perspective, since I'm not an expert in the insurance world, that it's difficult to make too many generalizations right now. But it's fair to say we're very interested to see how it may dictate, future market decisions of where people may or may not live.
Yep. I talked to the Insurance Industry Association, and at one point, this is a number of years ago, they pointed out to me that a big hailstorm that covers, sort of rips across a state can be a bigger issue for their insurance companies than a wildfire. And I think that, that changes depending on where the fire is, et cetera. But as somebody so focused on forests, didn't never occurred to me that, it may not be as big a deal to them. So I think that's part of the issue. Carl says, great message today. Thank you so much for taking the land use piece, as those decisions are incredibly important to how codes and standards are ultimately applied at the community level. And then he says that IWUIC model can be adopted and made applicable with retroactive provisions. However, we are not aware of any AHJ that has taken the challenge to date. So
Yeah.
Sort of reinforcing what you said, I think, Molly.
Yeah, thanks, Carl. It's helpful to know or just confirm that, because that's our experience too. But certainly, I'm always curious if there is an example out there. We don't want to miss it.
Yep. Let's see. Natty asks about recordings, and yes, we will share the recording. It'll be on the Southwest Fire Science Consortium webpage. And then Faith had another question. Molly, thank you so much for the great presentation. Are there, to your knowledge, NGOs or other groups or initiatives that help out facilitating conversations about planning with local land use planners, fire marshals, building inspectors?
Oh, thanks, Faith, and it's good to see you. I don't know if this is maybe I hope this answer is okay, but that's actually one of the reasons why we started a nonprofit, is because we wanted to be able to, that's what we do, is facilitate those conversations, and wanted to be able to do it in a way that wasn't, that we could do with, maybe wasn't seen as, for whatever reason, like a for-profit. So, Faith, I'd be happy to talk to you about that. There are many other around the country. I think it's very site dependent. There are many other local groups that I know stand in and support those roles as well. I think the Fire Adapted Communities Network and the different state networks also do a fantastic job just bringing people together and facilitating these types of conversations. So we're always happy to engage in that, and we're also happy to recommend, local folks that we're aware of that can play that role too.
Great, and I see Emily posted some resources here around CWPPs and some examples, and that same link will get you to the Fire Adapted Communities Network, which, as Molly just mentioned, I think if you're working in a community and looking for some organization to facilitate that kind of dialogue, I certainly would turn to the FACnet as a good place to start. And then Carl noted that the Code Council is happy to facilitate those conversations. So it sounds like folks out there to participate in those conversations, and it may just be a question of a little bit of networking to find the right people locally. So we're a little bit over time, so we should probably try to wrap up here. Molly, I want to thank you again. Really important conversation. I think the land use issue is going to be a big driver over the rest, certainly, of my career. So thanks for a good, this is real solid background information and some good looks to the future and where things are headed. So thank you very much. Thanks everybody for participating. Great group. And I hope to see you all on future Southwest Fire Science Consortium webinars. So thanks everybody.
Thanks so much, everyone. It was great to have the opportunity to present and share all of this. So please feel free to be in touch.